everyone, and welcome to Gaming Mechanics, a podcast that seeks to explore the unexplored topic in games, how they work, and why we love them. My name is Greg, and with me is Mark.
Hello, everyone.
And today we will be talking, ironically, about the nebulous, ethereal word that gets thrown around very much when talking about games, particularly in journalism, content, and the lack of content, or too much content even, which is really far less a problem, but is still a thing. So today's episode will be slightly more nebulous than certainly last week's, where Mark had a brilliantly planned out structure. We have some thoughts and a few things written down, but in large part we're going to be just kind of thinking about the existential problem of content in video games.
Yes.
Both directions, and a few possible solutions, but more just kind of a meditation on what it's all about. In case you are listening for the first time, this is a incredibly arrogant podcast.
Yes, it is.
Meditation on the existential question of content. Maybe not arrogant, more so just
far-reaching.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yes. We really do try to.
We look for the unexplored.
Yeah, we explore the unexplored, and it's in the title. And we try to do so in a way that's thoughtful, and we don't claim to have like the right answer, but we usually try to come to some compelling conclusions by our own estimation. And there was actually a little bit of irony with brainstorming for this episode. Typically, we don't do episodes 4 days apart. This week, because of some recording glitches, we actually are doing that, and so we had a kind of a dearth of content in our episodes. So it took us a little while to brainstorm and think through some talking points for this. So that was a little bit of irony on that.
Yes, the content episode being significantly light on content.
Yes.
But I think I think in large part this was born out of actually a pretty darn good article on PC Gamer, which I read a decent amount of. Some really good stuff on there, some not so great stuff, but the good stuff is very good. And it was basically talking about, particularly in the context of Sea of Thieves, that's kind of been blowing up the headlines, but also in terms of the past year's releases, in terms of Destiny 2, No Man's Sky, particularly games that were very, very heavily hyped and have since become far less revered than they were initially.
Right.
And the problem of content. Now, we've talked about content in terms of mostly just MMOs in the past, and kind of the way that an end game goes. And so we're not going to be talking about that as much because we've hit on those things, and some of these things will apply there. But in large part, we're going to be thinking about, as we tend to focus, single-player games, content in multiplayer, particularly multiplayer competitive games. Specifically competitive games. Sea of Thieves is multiplayer, of course. But competitive games in general, the content, the thing to do is to get better, right? There's a self-fulfilling reward. The example given, Rocket League, right? There's a car. There's not a whole. There's not been much content added to Rocket League,
right?
And that game for hours and hours and hours and hours, and it does not get old. So content is not as simple as a kind of absolute amount of stuff, right? If in a physical sense, it wouldn't just be the mass of the game, the amount of stuff in it,
right?
Which I think a lot of people tend to conflate it with, or is at least very often talked about. Like, there's not enough things to do. Well,
right.
Rocket League, exactly one thing to do. And yet no one complains about the content of Rocket League.
Exactly. I think that's a great starting point for this discussion, is to sort of let's really pick apart this criticism and try to understand what it's actually saying. And I contend that it's a very poorly phrased criticism. Sort of like it's really immersive is a really poorly phrased praise for a game. Like, okay, cool, that tells me almost nothing about what you enjoyed.
Exactly. Different ways by different people. I feel like very much so it's become just kind of the scapegoat of, hey, not enough content. Done. Check. Didn't like it.
Well, yeah, like the game was boring, but games can be boring for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, exactly. Precisely. So that's an interesting. So anyway, we won't talk too much about the competitive side of things because the content is, in fact, like I said, the getting better, the intrinsic reward, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of even just like aesthetics and Overwatch, but even then, you don't play Overwatch for the skins, really. I mean, at least I don't. In terms of the way my perception of it too is that loot boxes are a nice piece on top of it. They are not what keep you playing the game. It's a nice kind of little spike to the dopamine system, rather serotonin system, your reward processes that keeps you semi-interested in it. But the reason you boot up the game is not to get the next loot box, right? Is to play the game because the game's fun, and you want to get. And so that's pretty much long and short. But the important thing about that is, I think the takeaway from that point is that there is more to content than simply the amount of stuff in the game, which I think even this podcast has probably kind of used as shorthand to talk about it.
Yeah.
So, and the other side of this that got me thinking too was the fact that PCG article talking about, well, there's another PCG article actually after. We don't get all of our ideas from this, but this one flowed into it well, it was just the question of the week that they do, and the editors will talk about it, and then comments will sound off. But it was about games that overstayed their welcome or games that went on too long. Mm-hmm. And as I was thinking about that and looking through the answers in general, a lot of a pattern emerged, which was the idea of too much content, actually, being a thing, particularly nowadays with kind of Ubisoft games and open world kind of being the general direction. I don't know. Point is, there's a huge, less talked about thing that is games with too much content.
Right.
I don't as much vocal complaint about it because I do think it is a little bit less common. But I think that it does beg the question that content is just not a strictly good thing, right? Just more content equals better game. I don't think that's so.
No, I don't think so. And I think that one of the reasons you don't hear about it is because people are fine walking away from a game when they've gotten what they want out of it.
Right.
And hopefully, the problem with like too much content is that you risk the core experience of the game. The thing you really want the player to experience gets lost. And that would be a real tragedy, and I think that really could ruin a game. But as long as players are able to find that core experience, they can do it as much as they want, and then they leave, it's okay if there's more stuff that they didn't do, because the player just frankly doesn't care to do that stuff.
Yeah, and that's I think it's a good transition point into talking about like the one of our kind of ways of thinking about this, or at least a way to bring structure of this problem, was thinking in terms of what a game is asking you to buy into, basically. What's the game asking you to, not just the fantasy portion of it, but what's it asking you to expect from it, basically?
Right.
What does it seem to be implying it's going to be? And part of this is certainly in the marketing, but even past that, the way the game is set up and the way the game, the setting, the gameplay loop, all of that goes into it. And then the example being, basically, a game has either, in our kind of short thesis, well, I guess we'll start here, a game seems to have too much or too little content when the amount of content in the game, or the amount of tools and pieces of things to interact with in the game don't line up with either too much or too little the expectation the game gives you of what to be expecting.
Right. So either it distracts from the core experience because there's so many tools and there's so many things that you could be doing, or it feels like you can't even attain the core experience because you don't have the tools to do what you thought you were going to be able to do, or what the game seemingly promised that you'd be able to do. Like if if Arkham Asylum promised that you'd be able to beat Batman, and it only allowed you to use like the Batmobile and that was it, that would be really unsatisfying, right? Like Batman does other stuff other than just drive around in the Batmobile.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if there was only one wing of Arkham Asylum you could go in, and the rest of it disappears, couldn't even finish the story, right? That sort of thing. That would feel absolutely. If they could only throw batarangs,
right?
That would feel empty, and that would not be delivering. The example we kind of kept on coming back to and thinking about as kind of a core example, partially just because it's a big hot button. I mean, it used to be, but it's still being talked about. But also, it's a really fascinating just study of a game, honestly, outside of all of the kind of pomp and flaming rage that goes along with it. But No Man's Sky is a fascinating game in a lot of ways, I think, for both its the hype that came with the failure that it eventually had to deliver, but also how it's responded over time and what they've done to try to fix things, as well as the result of those fixes. In large part, it seems they've done a lot of really good things for the game in terms of adding these content-based things that we're talking about in terms of extra places to go, extra ships, extra ways to utilize the resources you have, extra tools to be able to help manage them, land vehicles, that sort of thing. New things to do and ways to interact with the core game experience. But at the end of the day, it seems like most consensus is still that there's an unsatisfactory level to it where it still wasn't quite reaching what it needs to do, which was the core game experience, what the game asked you to play into. What you thought, I think what a lot of people were so excited about when they saw trailers or the hype about it. This goes into just the danger of early access development when you can see a game from its literal very beginnings of the concept all the way through execution. That's just, I don't think it's a great idea.
Yeah.
This concept is really easy to make sound good and get excited about. But anyway, point is, I think the core thing that people were buying into was this very Star Trek-esque limitless adventure. I think adventure being the key word there, that you are always going to be discovering something new. Everything will be unique every single time, and that feeling of discovery and that feeling of logging, cataloging will not get old, but that will be the thing that continually brings you back. And the function, the mechanic that they were going to use to ensure that was going to happen was the procedural generation. At the end of the day, the procedural generation just didn't cut it, right?
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't able to evoke those feelings. It got actually really boring really quick. Because that level of that promise is immense, right? This feeling of like actual exploration, actual novelty and discovery over and over.
Right.
That is an extremely hard thing to promise. And it turns out the procedural generation idea was cool in that it did technically give all of these unique combinations, but it turns out these unique combinations, unique did not mean interesting.
Yeah, it didn't mean... I think that I want to draw a line here between like exploration and adventure.
Yeah,
right?
Sure.
Like, there's an infinite amount to explore. There isn't really an infinite amount of, like, adventure. And I guess I would say adventure, like, exploration is needed for adventure, for sure. Yeah. But, like, it's not sufficient for something to be considered an adventure. Like, you've got to have difficulties and struggles and things to overcome and a goal and a purpose and, probably people to come with you. I think all of those things are important aspects of an adventure.
Totally.
And you got to have some sort of a conclusion. And like all of those things are largely absent from No Man's Sky. Yeah, you can have other people. It didn't seem like there was a ton of tension or narrative in any of the things you were doing. There's certainly no conclusion.
Yeah. Well, and I think that really comes down to that thing we were talking about earlier, which was like, I think, a very deep misunderstanding of what content means, even by the developers, in terms of, again, if you're measuring it in that like kind of very absolute binary measurable way, right, where just sheer number of unique things in the game. Mm-hmm. Rocket League would have very little content, and No Man's Sky actually does have something resembling infinite content in terms of technically all of those planets and creatures are unique.
Right.
If you're by unique content, then No Man's Sky is one of the fullest games possible at this point with technology,
And I think that there's a certain type of person which that is really going to appeal to. But I contend that it's actually a relatively small number of people that like exploring just for exploration's sake. Now, like, hear me out. Like, people who do pure math, right? Like, they're just exploring to do it. Like, just to see what happens. There's literally nothing attached to it. They're not trying to improve some discipline. They're not trying to make anyone's life better. They just want to see what's going to happen. But it's actually a fairly small number of people that are just interested in looking at what's different just because it's different.
For that sake.
Yeah, people look for new things all the time, but they look for new things because it gives them something to talk about with other people, or because it's entertaining, or because they might learn something. All those things are good motivations for doing exploration. But simply exploring, I would say that's actually a pretty limited number of people you're targeting there.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, too, what I was going to say was that fascinating even in that definition of content, and we've already kind of discussed this. I don't know if I have to keep on driving it home, but I think that's insufficient in that, even ironically, the refrain that you heard from both players and reviewers and basically everyone about the game was that it felt empty, which is deep, considering, like I said, the promise to the technology that was put in place, which was really the core. That game lived and died on the procedural generation, and it didn't work. So in that case, it's a great example of this game asked you to kind of come back to our original point. The game asked us to begin engaging with this fantasy of exploration, this very deep. Even Mark, you brought up a great point talking about how a game like this very easily begs like kind of more existential questions, even in the player, right? In terms of the openness, the vastness of space, the aloneness of the human condition, the question of meaning and all that jazz, which the game supplies absolutely nothing for.
Right.
So it makes a lot of sense why there's these things that the game kind of begs in its DNA, right? There's nothing narrative about it that does that. It doesn't ask the question verbally or anything like that. But in a game exploring the cosmos and finding the center of the universe, like, of course that's going to be the natural place where most people will go, even subconsciously. And so hence when nothing about that story or that desire gets touched by the game, there will be like a feeling of innate emptiness, both in terms of the way the game serves itself up, like I said, more on the technical side, but also even like philosophically, emotionally, your experience of it just felt very flat. So I think that's a great example of a contentless lack of content because the game asked you for so much and promised so much. Again, not even just in its promotion, but in the way that it was set up. Right? You can't have a game that solely, if the only pleasure you're getting out of it is this sense of exploration that does tap into something very deep and very primal and very powerful in the human experience, that didn't have the resources and the tools to be able to make the player feel or experience. At least not.
I think you're right that, like, I like your point about like the existential problem that I think it almost seems like No Man's Sky has sort of fit into an existential uncanny valley of sorts, because you're in a very vast universe, not unlike our own, but you've basically stripped all the things out of the universe which people used to derive meaning from it. And you by immediately starting a person off with the ability to basically unlimited mobility, that creates a problem, because one of the things that make objects and places and people meaningful in our lives is that we invest in them. And so, spending money, spending time, spending energy on something makes it important to you and can give you a sense of purpose and meaning and things like that. And No Man's Sky really doesn't have that, because it allows you to be so mobile that you don't have to invest in anything. In fact, now you have the base building, which is like, I think that's the right direction for this game to be moving, because you can invest in the creation of your sort of home base, and that can make a planet sort of distinct and unique and more meaningful, because like, I built my base there.
And there's mine, and there's something that I can begin pouring a little bit of meaning, some identity into. Amongst this endless, formless universe that I am otherwise alone in. So I think No Man's Sky is a great, like I said, both existentially and some bigger questions, but also just I think it's a great example of an empty game, a game that's short on content. I think it's similar to kind of going to MMOs. MMOs ask you to invest your life into them, right? They're role-playing games. People will attend funerals and weddings in MMOs, and appropriately. So there's people that really develop a full virtual life there. So when you begin losing the ability to do things that are meaningful in the context of the game in that place, suddenly it feels like there's a lack of content, because the game has asked you to believe and put a piece of yourself into it that is like very large. It's very non-negligible. It's asking you to treat it as a never-ending life-based thing, and life does have unlimited content, right?
Yeah, it does.
Real world. That's why when games, it's just hilarious to think about. Again, back to that standardized version of content. World of Warcraft is one of the biggest games I could imagine. Actually, I mean, the sheer amount of things to do in that game is almost incomprehensible.
Yeah,
I don't
it really
know.
is.
Agreed, actually, and people can still whine about lack of content in that game, and very often do, and content drops and all that jazz. So it's very much an expectation based thing. It's a more cyclical back and forth thing that both the game and the player has responsibility for, more so than just one under the other. I don't think it's good for developers to be like, screw you, like, figure it out, enjoy your game, keep on playing it, and we're not going to give anything, versus the players just kind of be whining and always wanting something new and better. I think it's a back and forth.
Well, and people, it's very interesting. We talked about this a little bit on our MMO episode, where I talked about the spontaneous generation of the Tarren Hill battle zone back in Vanilla WoW. It was a battle between Tarren Hill and Stormwind, I believe, which was a little area in the East continent, and it was basically a spontaneous battleground before battlegrounds were a thing in WoW, and players just fought between these two cities all the time. And that would be an example of players creating their own content. And I actually think it was one of the most fun and compelling parts of the game. I really enjoyed it. I was kind of sad when they came out with Battlegrounds, because I was like, great, now nobody's going to do this, in-world PvP that was happening, that I found really compelling. And so I think that developers should foster and encourage efforts like that by their players, because the reality is, most games, the mechanics are deep enough where players could get creative and basically make just something fun themselves. Players are good at like, imagining like, we try to protect the rock. Like, imagine there's some weird looking rock, and like all of a sudden, a clan has decided that occupying that rock is the most important thing, and they kill anybody who gets near it. And then another clan gets word of it, and there's like a King of the Hill game that goes on that was just spontaneously generated. Like, that would be really fun. I think when players get so focused on waiting for the devs to feed them content, they miss a lot of the fun things that they could be doing. And I'm not saying that, like, devs don't get a free pass. Like, yeah, devs do need to provide content for their games. That's important. But, like, players could be engaging and having so much more fun if they stopped just looking to the devs.
I like that. That's a good point. Particularly in terms of we've talked about the style of game, particularly. I mean, we were talking about earlier, Mark and I were, sorry, not on the cast, but the idea of, like, weekly updates on a game, or weekly content additions.
Yeah.
And how, in large part, that's, I mean, not being game developers, of course, we're always you have to have a little bit of grain of salt, but at the same time, man, I'd see almost no possible way in which case that would be possible.
Yeah.
If we're at the point, culturally as gamers, where that is something that we're even thinking of requiring, that does seem to beg a very deep question of, like, where's the fun coming from? How needy are we? Like, I mean, again, an imperfect, but I think worthy comparison being, think about old games that weren't able to have that, and people were, it's not just this simple kind of like, you have fun with your ball on a stick back in the old day, right?
Right.
But at the time, there's a level of, like, there is some goodness to kind of human creativity and imagination, and working with something and finding other ways to enjoy it other than only ever waiting for the next piece. And that goes into balance. We've talked about that with changing metas, right? When you don't balance a game, you'll have an incredibly compelling game that changes and develops and moves and so on and so forth. So that's an interesting. I like that that concept. I don't know if that's just a kind of old fogey sort of thing, but the idea of being able to enjoy a game, even when it doesn't have the.
Yeah. Well, it does kind of remind me of, like, old people saying, like, back in our day, we made our own fun, Like, I realize that, like, saying go defend a rock and WoW and with your clan is like a little weird, but I don't want to be, like, reductionistic about it. Like, I think there are some real problems, but I just wonder if, like, maybe they're fundamental problems where the rate at which devs can be reasonably expected to produce content is just never going to keep pace with the massive number of people who are consuming that content. And so you have to start turning the content generation back. You have to crowdsource it. You have to turn it back onto the players, because if you don't do that, you're never going to create a sustainable content production line.
Yep. So let's go to the other that argument slash the other side of the pendulum. I had mentioned kind of, I think, an easy target being the is it Ubisoft or Ubisoft? I've heard it so many different ways. I've always said Ubisoft.
I say Ubisoft, man. I don't know.
But one of us is right. But those games, particularly kind of exemplified by the Assassin's Creed games, there's a lot of content in those games by standard definition, and in some ways not enough too, right? There's those games would tend to be considered more on the heavy end of content, or there being too many things to do that don't really have any meaning or any ability to compel the player or play into the fantasy the game is asking you to play into, right? For Assassin's Creed, I've played, God, which one? I think Black Flag 4. I played a decent amount of 4. That's a gigantic game and a very fun game in a lot of ways. None of this is to say if games are good or bad necessarily. But one of the huge things about Assassin's Creed, of course, is certainly trying to buy in, depending on the time era, into the fantasy of this masterful stealth-based assassin, obviously. And for Black Flag, it was particularly the pirate side of it, and getting to inhabit these fantastical time zones and these kind of fantastical versions of the world. You know, they're not real historical. It's more just kind of fun fantasy takes on historical times. Mm-hmm. And yet we have all these god almighty side quests and things to do, and we've talked about this before times where it can feel overwhelming to even get into a game, and that actually takes away from that main. When you're chasing, oh boy, what was it? It's a note, like a letter in the wind that you have to chase, and it's meant to be like testing your execution to be able to like jump across roofs, and it's just like a chase mechanic. Mm-hmm. But we have when you can't walk anywhere without one of those things blowing in front of you, and then feeling the gamer inclination to leave no stone unturned, so you go and have to chase it. You are literally across roofs chasing a piece of paper. And then you get it, and you don't know why you just spent 5 to 10 minutes doing that. Like, that is not playing into what the game is promising.
Not at all.
In terms of its fantasy or its emotional impact, you know. And there's a lot of things like that. There's all kinds of these weird kind of emotionless bounties and criminals and that don't really bring you anywhere forward into that feeling of I don't know. It doesn't paint a big, huge picture of feeling like you're actually an assassin or part of an order or working towards anything or having some sort of goal. You're just kind of more. It very much feels like a kind of emotionless, empty thing in a similar way to the way that No Man's Sky had tons of content but didn't feel too, I don't know, full.
Yeah. I think... Like, that's an example, and I think I can kind of understand, like, where the devs were coming from, where the people who were making the game saw they had this really deep movement mechanic, and they thought, like, what's a way we can really challenge the players', movement and execution and give them an excuse to really move around these levels and to feel really good about being able to move and basically do parkour, right? We'll give them an incentive, we'll give them these papers blowing in the wind, it'll be awesome. But when you realize that most people are playing this game and the game is marketed on this idea that you're going to be a badass assassin, like, it doesn't really fit with the core experience of the game, and it's incredibly distracting because you as a gamer know, like, oh, I could get something, could find something. You've got those operant conditioning, dopamine, serotonin systems actually working against you because they're distracting the player from what you actually want them to be experiencing.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think there's, I don't know, it seems to me that there's some level that can go both ways, right? Like, we've been talking in terms of, like, too much or not enough, and in both ways, by some standards, there's too much content in No Man's Sky, right? That it was basically empty, and people complain about not enough content. In Assassin's Creed, people can kind of look at the same thing, where there's a lot of empty content, and say there's, like, too much. most interesting thing where it goes kind of both ways.
Right.
I think the main difference for me would be you very rarely in a game like No Man's Sky or Sea of Thieves will feel overwhelmed by the amount of shit that you have to do to like have your fun.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in Assassin's Creed, I remember booting up the game and feeling like there was so many things to do, I didn't even know where to start, and it was like semi-stressful. So, while the emotional experience of emptiness might be similar, I think there is a difference between those two things where it felt, even though both of them were ultimately unmotivating to be playing the game, there's a very different flavor to it, I think, for a game that would be too big versus a game that feels too empty,
Yeah.
I do think there's variation.
Like, feeling the overwhelmed and stress of like trying to find the game once you've already turned the game on is a little different than sort of feeling understimulated and like maybe there's just not really anything interesting here, which would be an example like at least early on in No Man's Sky. I have read that there have been updates. I hope that they are good. But
as far as I can tell, the updates have been well received. It still just kind of came down to that core thing that it wasn't able to deliver on.
But you don't want to log into Assassin's Creed and then have to slog your way through a bunch of stuff before you start assassinating people. Like, I certainly don't. Let's get to it, man. That sounds awesome. I saw the guy do it in the trailer. He was, like, crouched down. He was pretending he was, like, a priest or something. And then he, like, jumped out of the crowd and he stabbed that guy. Like, that's what I want to do.
Yeah, exactly. So that brings us to another interesting version of this, just another kind of example, one we always come back to. Seemingly impossible to avoid, but is so deep and has so many ways to think about it. Our forever favorite, Elder Scrolls the Fifth,
yes.
Skyrim. And this was a foil for me for a second, thinking about, okay, if in fact the game, if with this kind of mini thesis of, right, a game is going to, a correct amount of content for a game is when it matches up with the player's expectation, or what the game seems to ask the player to expect from it. Then Skyrim, which is obviously, massively lauded for being extremely content-rich, not having too much, having kind of a very open-ended version of never being able to be exhausted, but also not being exhausting, didn't seem to fit until I realized that the fantasy wasn't, in my opinion at least, in terms of all the way the game is set up and the mechanics. The game isn't set up. If you look at the game and the progression systems and the world and the fast travel and all the systems that make the game, it would not immediately occur to you that it was designed to be an intensive single player story based game. Actually, it would occur to you that it was supposed to be like what the game is shouting at you is explore, adventure, create your own adventures, create your own stories. It's this big, huge, massive sandbox with just the right amount of tools and toys in it to be able to be explored. It's gigantic. It's beautifully made. There's a huge amount of unique content across it, and it does have limits. It has ends, and in that regard, of course, it succeeds. It's the standard for succeeding in that regard. So the game does ask you to adventure, and gives you arguably the best tool set for adventuring that games have done in a while. So in that regard, it has the perfect amount of content by that definition. In terms of if it was just about feeling like you were the Dragonborn in the story, not so much actually, because in that regard, by that definition, it might have too much content. But that's not the point. It's really not the point to kill Alduin in that game. It's really
right. Right. No, you're right. And if that was like the core experience, then I would say, that got lost. But it wasn't the experience people were signing up for. They didn't care that nobody played the story, or that most people have spent very little time on the main story, because it's just not what people wanted from the game. And I think that another thing that Skyrim has that No Man's Sky and Sea of Thieves to a lesser extent doesn't have is people, compelling characters to interact with. I think that's significant. Even if they're NPCs, like NPCs get a bad rap, but if you feel like I'm doing this quest for somebody, instead of just for myself, like Sea of Thieves, it's very, I'm getting the treasure, I want loot, I'm upgrading my clothes or whatever, my aesthetics. And No Man's Sky is fairly similar in that regard. Like, you're not you don't have a purpose by somebody else asking you, right? It's like, so you're not serving somebody else, you're not helping somebody, you're not solving a problem in the world. You're just sort of very self-focused.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, you don't see too many. I mean, even with the, Skyrim is an oldish game now, and the IAI quirks have since turned into personalities. But think about all the memes that have developed from the unique characters within the world, and the population, even being so imperfect, really was exactly what was needed in terms of something that you could bond with, something you could begin to get to know, invest in, kind of what you were saying in terms of if there's something you could invest in No Man's Sky in terms of base building or a planetary thing, or yeah, sure, if you could find like, as far as I can tell with the wildlife that you find in No Man's Sky, the interaction you can do with them after you find them is actually pretty minimal. If you could find another intelligent species and interact with an alien culture in a way that you hadn't known before, again,
right.
The amount of resources that this would take would be obscene. You couldn't do this procedurally, but it was a uniquely like cultural thing that you could meet in another intelligent spacefaring culture. People would, I mean, that would be insane, right? That sounds like a dream game, like meeting all these different cultures and peoples and ideas and combinations and ways that they survive depending on the planet and yada yada yada.
Yeah,
that'd be incredible. People would love that.
yeah. I mean, I think that would be really cool.
Maybe you want to stay, right? Maybe you find a place that you love enough that you want to stay in and help. None of that really seems to exist in the game as is.
No, and I think it would. You're right to point out that it would be it'd have to be a very dynamic game for that to be true. Like for there to be enough happening in a world that it was like you could stay and invest and like help an alien species. It would have to be fairly dynamic, like.
Yeah, exactly.
But I also, there's, even hearing you say that, there's a part of me that's like, there's just some unavoidable, like, Rick and Morty-esque existential questions that, like, an alien race that you encounter for the first time might be cool. But, like, by the time you're on, like, alien race number 60, you're just sort of like, whatever, this doesn't matter anymore.
You're right. I mean, that might just be a inherent flaw to the key gameplay, loop of discovering new things.
Right.
Because if discovering new things becomes an old thing,
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter what the new thing is. It isn't able to spark that same exact go to a new game. This brings up an point, which is there is a level of curmudgeonness, to a lot of the things that I feel like I say, maybe less so with Mark, but back in the day. No, just the changing way that games are certainly able to be released and patched, particularly content patches. A lot of times, I feel like the problem of content would be far better served by ending the game and then making a new game. Mark, we kind of talked about this in terms of like seasons almost. This kind of gets into this aspect of the Blizzard games, but you had an interesting point about the fact that it wasn't about something new every time necessarily. It was actually about the contrast between just different things. So you don't actually need a completely unique event every single year. You just need enough time between the events that you miss it and can come back to it.
Right. Yeah, absolute novelty is a seriously hard thing to come across in the real world. And most people don't get much of it in their life, and they don't spend their whole life bored, because it turns out that humans respond very well to contrasting events or seasons in their life. You have in terms of weather, obviously, you've got weather patterns that repeat, over every single year, but it feels good to feel that cool fall breeze, or to see the first blossoms of spring, or to see the first snowfall of a year. Like, at least for me, that hasn't gotten old yet. I'm coming up on 30, and I think that's a testament. There aren't a lot of games that I've played for 30 years. There aren't any games I've played for 30 years and that still feel like, wow, this is new and fresh. And the reason I think is because of the cyclical nature is very stimulating to us as people. And even things that are well documented and well understood, when you have an experience that is contrasting with a previous sort of state that you were in, like being freezing cold in the winter and then being warm in the summer, that's significant. Or even personal seasons where like you are really super busy for like, 3 or 4 months out of the year, and then like the holidays come around and you're like, oh my gosh, this is great, I just want to be with my family. And then you get sick of family and you're like, all right, let's get back to work. And like that contrast is really engaging.
Yeah, which is really interesting too, because that's like I want to think more about just even psychologically in life. Because yeah, sorry, I'm have my own existential crisis over here, but because yeah, in general, humans are creatures of habit, right? You've heard that said probably just as kind of an off the cuff saying, but it's definitely true in terms of the way that we need routine and structure, and we evolved under a sun that came up at the same time every day, and yada yada yada. But at the same time, there is that. You're absolutely right in terms of that sine wave of motion that can be really, really powerful. It's the same reason why at the end of the summer, a summer day doesn't hit you nearly as hard as it does in May. I'm up in Michigan, right, and we just got snow today on April 17th. It felt like December. It was probably like 25 windy, and it was snowing heavily. And we got like half an inch of accumulation, and it was miserable. And the second, I saw we have a day that's supposed to be, I think Saturday's supposed to be in the 60s. And when that rolls around, it's going to be insane. Same exact day in November, or maybe November's too late, but, August, wouldn't matter. So I think, similarly, the game equivalent of this, what they actually came up with, was one of our old whipping boys, Diablo, in that the season aspect where it forces you to reset, go back to level 1, and play up through and see how far you get, and you get a few rewards. But the rewards, when we're thinking about it, weren't even that unique. I mean, in large part, it's a pre-existing set that you could already have in the game. It's a stash tab is the other big one, but in general, the seasons don't have a whole lot of hugely dynamic, compelling rewards. So at the end of the day, maybe it was just the fact that, hey, all things considered, Diablo 3 is a fun game, and playing from 1 to 70 and then past 70 for a little bit is just fun for a while.
Yeah.
And it's great to do for too long, but hey, it is worth coming back every few months and re-experiencing that, maybe with a new class or what have you. And that only works because of that kind of cyclical nature. So at the same time, I don't know.
And I think
that's absolutely zero. Like new content is being put into that. That's not a needed. I mean, like I said, the seasons have slight differences, but in general, it's just you're falling back on something that is kind of just inherent in the game.
Yeah, something that is tried and true and that's been very polished, and like, yeah, they've added stuff to Diablo. They've added the Necromancer class this year. They did the Kanai's Cube a year or two, I guess 2 years ago now, and like that was those are significant updates to the game. But still, what you're not going to spend most of your time interacting with the cube, right? I mean, unless you're like really like pushing end tier stuff.
Right.
If you're playing through seasons, like, yeah, you're going to have the season of engaging with this game and playing through Diablo, and then you're going to be done, and maybe you'll try a new class or something, but then the season is taking time off the game, right? Like, you have the season, and then you have a season where you don't play Diablo. And, like, apparently to a lot of game developers, that is, like, just a terrible thing to have happen. But
yeah, like,
I don't... We keep coming back to this question. I'm not sure why, but giving players a chance to step away from your game and then re-experience it is a fine thing.
Yeah, and that used to be like how sequels were made. Like we kind of talked about earlier. This idea of kind of the forever game, and Destiny 2 being one of the better examples of a game that seems to promise a place where people could sink hours every single day. And never ever run out, and that's like, I don't know. This gets into a bigger question of just art and endings being a good thing. That being having an endpoint to any journey, anything that you're doing in large part is actually good, and so hence that lends itself far better to the idea of a series of games where you have a game and then the game is over. And those tend, of course, that still happens, right? It's Destiny 2 and Destiny 3 will come, but at the same time, those will be far, far more stretched out than games of the past where you had series of games. And in general, just trying to I don't know, maybe elongate, trying to play into that kind of foreverness of it, where you can, where it's assumed that you're just going to be playing this game perpetually. That seems like a fool's errand at the end of the day, as opposed to this idea of seasonally. I mean, it happened with Overwatch. I think Blizzard's pretty good at this, honestly, of being able to bring people back for a while and you play for a few months. I've done that with at least 4 of their games. I mean, I never allowed myself to get too involved with WoW because I knew it would probably consume me. But, I mean, I did that with Heroes of the Storm. I played that on and off. I've definitely done that with Overwatch. Obviously done it with Diablo. And it works, and I have huge amounts of enjoyment from it. And I guess it doesn't monetize too easily, so that's one thing. But it certainly doesn't make me resent the game, you know?
Right. Yeah, you don't
eat me for years, you know?
I mean, because like when you talk about it not monetizing well, like I think that the sequel point you made, you know, that's a fairly easy road for monetization of seasonal content, right? Like you can reuse the same engine. You can make some, some changes, and you can give the players a slightly different experience in a very gated way by providing a sequel to a game. And so that would be one way I'd say you can monetize it. But also, like, just it seems like gaming, at least this sort of high content promise gaming, has sort of painted itself into a corner. Because even if you would say, like, you know, I'm really getting my money's worth from this content, or from this game, because look at all the content they're adding. Like, the marginal revenue for the developer is abysmal at that point, right? Like, providing weekly updates to a game for 3 years because you sold it to a player one time for $60 is terrible. Like, you have to staff developers for that whole time, and economically, that's just sort of a problem.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, this kind of goes back to, we've gotten a little bit off. I mean, the foreverness, right? When we talk about monetization for a game you come into every single day, that's how microtransactions came out, right? That's why microtransactions and loot boxes work, because that assumes you're going to be there every single day, and they require tiny transactions many times, and that actually adds up more than the single releases. So economically, I guess it makes sense why we've moved that direction of the kind of idea of this game that you can play hours every single day without fail. So that makes more sense, I guess. But at the same time, I don't think that breeds good games. I mean, like, I just think objectively that doesn't make the core point of gaming work well.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And I think you'll notice that, like, most games that are really loot box heavy, that really isn't what the game is about, as you mentioned with Overwatch. Like, the game isn't about trying to get cool skins. I mean, people do that, and some people, for them, that's what the game is about. But it's already a fun game. It's just sort of an excuse to come back and play it and to, you know, collect some cool loot.
And sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say that's like. They've already developed a fun core to the game, and this is something that augments it.
I mean, it seems to be the point we come back to over and over again, which is if you have a good experience with the game, a lot of the stuff that we can pick apart for hours, a lot of our podcasts actually kind of just come down to that, right? Like, if you were to strip apart all of our arguments and all of our analysis, it comes down to, like, well, is the core gameplay of the game good? Then it's actually pretty hard to mess things up. Like,
yeah.
Do that, and there's examples of all these different things that we've talked about that can be done well. I mean, microtransactions and loot boxes, well, I guess let's go at least loot boxes within certain constraints work, right? Blizzard, Overwatch, I have no problems with the loot boxes. I don't get the drops I want, but hey,
who does?
Exactly. So, you know, and same thing, we've talked about, like, WoW, and that works in terms of the content. That seriously makes...
I think, even as you were talking, I was thinking, like, it's just hard to make content be, like, the thing. Like, the game loop. Like, content is not a game loop. That would be, like, something I would want as a soundbite from this podcast. Like, a game loop is sort of... It's repetitive by its nature. It's a loop. and you're going through this loop, and if going through the repetition isn't fun, then no amount of like new stuff is going to help that.
Yeah.
Right? Like the loop will always be the loop. It will always be repetitive.
Yep. And that's why you think about the difference between, about Breath of the Wild versus, say, something more like No Man's Sky. I mean, again, we've been talking about single-player stuff here, but Sea of Thieves is interesting in terms of that's a multiplayer No Man's Sky in some ways. Like, part of the promise of that game was being able to form crews and all the freedom that comes along with and all the social dynamics that could come out of that. And there's been some funny stuff, right? Like, one of my favorite stories. Did I ever tell this one on air?
No.
No? Okay, the weird thing that has swept, like, multiple people have reported this happening. And it might be the internet just being the internet, but I definitely believe this happened to at least someone, which was being a captain getting mutinied upon by his crew, getting locked in the brig, and then the crew sinking the ship and pulling out accordions and surround the doomed captain as the ship sinks, playing accordions, not breaking eye contact.
Oh my gosh. It sounds like creepypasta or something.
I know. Well, it just sounds... Well, yeah, exactly. But it's wonderfully weird and concerning and begs so many questions and is an incredible amount of, preparation and actual cohesion that was needed in the group to do that.
Right.
Like stories like... but at the same time, there's not a whole lot of... The fact that we're kind of reduced to that in the game, as opposed to doing actually piratey things that make people feel awesome.
Right.
Straight trolling usually isn't a great sign of health in a multiplayer experience, when that's really the most important thing to do.
Right. It's just mess with other people who are like less, less aware of what the state of the game is.
Right, because the second that people once that becomes a thing and everyone's doing it, then that's not fun anymore. People find ways around it, and then suddenly you're done, and you need a new fad.
Yeah.
So that's... Yeah, and I think that goes back to, again, like, is, as fun as it is trapping your captain, playing accordions and drowning, key to the thing that Sea of Thieves was trying to sell, in terms of feeling like a pirate, and the freedom of the high seas and the adventure therein. I think adventure is a really difficult thing to capture, man.
It is, and again, I would say it's really hard to make that a loop, right?
Yeah.
Like and what I'm landing on in this
part
episode
of adventure is its unpredictability and its specificness, right? It's hard to just have a never-ending adventure.
Yeah. Well, almost by definition, like adventures usually have phases. And, you hope that they come to an end so that you can get some rest.
Single-player game is better.
Stop indoctrinating our audience, Greg.
I know. Please, I've been indoctrinating them for 39 episodes. I'm finally speaking up.
Okay, fine. But I do think what I'm landing on with this episode is just, like, making new things interesting is really easy and kind of lazy. Like, making the same thing interesting over and over again, like Rocket League, I would say that is much harder, and that is the job of a game developer. And it's hard. It's hard to make something that people can do over and over again, and they don't get tired of it.
And there's a reason that is not the classic, if it was easy, everyone would be doing it. I mean, there's some truth to that, right?
Yeah.
Game devs will follow the money, but at the end of the day, too, I mean, there's Sean... Day 9 Plot, who's one of my favorite commentators and just personalities on the internet in general, and someone I respect and a ton. Did a lot of esports stuff, and he's a brilliant guy, studied math, and he's an undergrad master's and something else at USC. But anyway, point is, real smart guy, really intelligent guy, brilliant guy, lived a lot of his adult life at esports and video games, and very thoughtful. And joined a game dev team for a few years called Artillery, and his consistent response to it when asked how things were going was, and I don't know too much about the specifics of the inner workings of the game. He ended up leaving, and I don't know if the game ever released or not, but the point is, he would just be like, making games is hard, dude. Like, this is insane. Like, how does anyone do this? How do people make fun games? How is anything fun? Like, this is, and and he's obviously played up a little bit, but the fact that this guy was just objectively successful and I'd say brilliant. When it got down to it, there's a non-negligible portion of some secret sauce that just has to happen with fun games that is not guaranteed, and it was a small game, but at the same time, like I'm saying, like I think this thing when we talk about this, like just make a fun game or a good gameplay loop, that is not that's not simple. Maybe it's simple. It's not.
It's not easily done.
No. That's not a just like, okay, if all the games did this, then they'd be better games. There's something inherently difficult about it, apparently.
Yeah, and
as a non-game dev, don't worry about.
Well, and that's why I don't want this to come out as like we're bashing like all games that don't have enough content or whatever. Like, not at all.
They have to.
I think that I just want to refocus the discussion on what is the actual problem. It's not really content. It is the repetitive actions that players are taking and the fact that that is not fun and that cannot be sort of or overcome by just throwing a lot of stuff at them. Like,
yeah, exactly.
Like that trend in gaming needs to die. And so I guess I'll get on that soapbox of like, you can't throw stuff at a player and distract them from realizing that what they're doing over and over again isn't fun.
And particularly when you contrast that with a promise or an expectation given by the game itself, saying, hey, this game's going to be like this, and here's all these cool things you get to do, and then it just throws all these other things that are kind of pale and lifeless. They'll be even more pale and lifeless because you're expecting them to be something different than they actually are objectively, right? So that is, I agree entirely. And I don't think that I don't know. I don't think the answer to this is to make better. Like I agree with you when you say like I don't want to just bash games that there's some experimentation, right? Like maybe games like No Man's Sky and Sea of Thieves have to exist. They take a chance on something and it doesn't work out, and maybe that's impossible to know until you release the game and find out, hey, this didn't work out this way, and people will learn from that and see that, and that comes along. Like, there's got to be room for. I don't want to just claim that all these perfect games come out of nowhere either. Like, they're built on the shoulders of other stuff, and sometimes those are failures. I don't want to certainly objectively say that Sea of Thieves or No Man's Sky was a mess and shouldn't have existed. Like, who knows who was inspired by that or played that and saw this thing that they didn't like and how that affected the course of games. Like,
yeah,
just. Successful doesn't mean it was a complete waste of space and deserves to be just hated.
No, not at all.
So much acid. Like I said, the growth and development of quote unquote not as good, maybe bad games. That'd be an interesting episode to do, talking about like the power of bad games to like make things better.
Yeah. It can give you a look at. What is actually enjoyable about a game, and then just discovering things, it turns out, appears to be insufficient.
Yep.
So now we know that thanks to these games.
Yeah. I mean, it's probably pale praise for the developers of these games at the end of the day, but at the same time, it's something.
Right. All right, guys. Well, I think that's a pretty good stopping spot. And if you would like to criticize the content of this episode or give us feedback of any sort, you can email us, mark@gamingmechanics.net or greg@gamingmechanics.net. That will get to your respective addressee. And we will see you next week.
Sounds good. You guys have a good one.
If you enjoyed this episode of Gaming Mechanics, check out our Twitter @GamingMechanics or our Facebook by going to facebook.com/gamingmechanics. Thanks for listening.